Today on the Word Preacher Podcast, a foundation of trust, trials of faith, apocalyptic visions, and an unfailing kingdom. I'm Brett Jensen, and this is the Word Preacher Podcast. Our Come Follow Me curriculum for this coming week will bring us at last to the book of Daniel. This is one of the most important books in all the scriptures. And it begins with a really remarkable story. Daniel and some of his friends, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, have been handpicked from among those who have been extracted from the rebellious kingdom of Judah during the reign of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. So these are young men who came from a nation that had become famous, even infamous, for finding excuses not to live their faith. Look at what our neighbors are doing. There's nothing wrong with also including some idolatry in with what we're doing with the temple. Why do we have to be so judgmental of others? We could live at all. Kind of nonsense. Ultimately, these young men had actually excellent excuses to kind of be more accepting of a foreign culture. They were chosen to be instructed in the Chaldean language, given a portion of the king's meat and wine. This isn't like just feed that they were giving refugees that had been relocated. This is the good stuff, intended to be a great honor. They're given Babylonian names: Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. And in spite of the goodness that they receive and the ease with which they might have justified adjusting their commitments to their faith, Daniel and his friends refuse to eat the king's meat or drink the wine. If we read in Daniel chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." So to understand the context of this request is not only something that could be viewed as, what a picky, self-absorbed, prideful individual who's demanding their specific dietary needs be considered. What an obnoxious person. It absolutely could have been viewed that way. But it was more than that. Even though the prince of the eunuchs, to whom Daniel was speaking, was endeared to Daniel, he liked him, he was concerned that, hey, if this idea of yours doesn't even work out, if I were to try to do what you said, I could be killed. His life was in jeopardy. Daniel proposed a 10-day trial. And it's important to note, he didn't know what the result of a 10-day trial would be, but he hoped that God would help him in his efforts to be faithful. Let's read starting in verse 12. "Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants." So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in the flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzor took away the portion of their meat, and the wine they should drink, and gave them pulse. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Okay, so pulse in this case, you can read that as meaning like ground up vegetables, that sort of thing, is food that would be in keeping with the law of Moses, as opposed to meat from animals that, does this one have cloven hooves and chew its cud? Who knows? They had no way of knowing. So it guaranteed that they would be eating appropriate food in harmony with the Lord's law of health for them at that time. Early on, these young men proved that they could be trustworthy. And that's vital because when dangers and challenges arose later, it would have been too late to start living their commitments. They absolutely had to get started early. The same is true for us. Don't wait until you're in trouble to begin keeping your covenants. It means so much more when you choose to keep your covenants before the trouble comes. Don't wait till you get caught to confess your sins. Confess them now. Work on them now. It means more. It means more. All right, let's talk about the golden image on the plain of Dura. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego were present for this story. Daniel, for reasons that are not made known in the text, was not present. King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to set up a golden image and to have his kingdom worship it. And he was clear from the very beginning that this was not an optional request. Those who refused to bow down would be cast into a fiery furnace. So in the face of an unpleasant death, almost everyone did as the king commanded, but not Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. And of course, there were some, snitches who immediately went to accuse them of disobedience to Nebuchadnezzar himself. So Nebuchadnezzar was not happy, and he summoned them to ensure that his will be done. This is the reading, starting in verse 13 of chapter 3. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego? Do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now, if ye be ready, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, ye fall down and worship the image which I have made, well. But if ye worship not, ye shall be cast the same hour into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? Their response, given these circumstances, was incredibly courageous. We look in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego answered and said unto the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Again, they did not know whether God would save them. But even if not, they were determined to keep his commandments. The boldness of telling the king to his face that they were not careful to answer him, that's like saying, you're great and all, but we're serving someone more important than you. Nebuchadnezzar's reaction was swift. Verse 19, then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat the furnace 17 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, the furnace exceedingly hot, the flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. So it wasn't enough to burn them to death. He demanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter. And it wasn't hot enough just to kill Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, but the men who were holding them and tossed them in. The king personally oversaw the result of his order. Starting in verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished, and rose up in haste, and spake, and said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace, and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego came forth out of the midst of the fire. And the princes, governors, and captains, and the king's counselors being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. Incredible story. Absolutely incredible. The Hebrew in verse 25, and the King James Version renders the Son of God, could also be rendered the Son of the Gods. It doesn't necessarily mean Nebuchadnezzar was ready to convert to the true faith, but it's plain that he recognizes the divinity of a presence in the midst of the fiery furnace. In verse 28, he's called an angel. Nebuchadnezzar is so moved by what transpires that he threatens the destruction of any who speak against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego, and he promotes them in the province of Babylon. Again, devotion and faith, in spite of not knowing the consequences, putting God first, likely contributed to the preservation of all the exiled Jews during Babylonian rule. These demonstrations of faith all collectively contribute to a betterment of the entire people, the faith of God. All right, let's discuss an unusual beastly transformation. Daniel chapter 4 is written in a first-person narrative from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar himself. He calls Daniel to express concerns over a dream he has had, trust that Daniel has earned in Daniel chapter 2, which we will come back to later. He has seen in his dream a great tree that prospers and flourishes, but is cut down, and it's decreed by a voice that it will receive a beast's heart until 7 times pass over him. Its stump and roots will remain, and then after that time it will revert to its former self. The purpose to inform that the Most High rules men, and that he should be humbled. It's of note that as courageous as Daniel was, he was not eager to interpret the dream of the king, respecting that it was not a good outlook for Nebuchadnezzar. And he uses some terms that soften the blow, declaring, "The dream be to them that hate thee, and the interpretation thereof to thine enemies." In other words, wishing this fate on the enemies of the king, even though he knows better. The interpretation of the dream is that the king is going to lose his sanity for a time and become as a beast. To further soften the blow, Daniel counsels the king to avoid this fate by repenting of his sins and showing mercy to the poor. But at the end of 12 months, Nebuchadnezzar was reveling in his own greatness, and while the words were in his mouth, it was fulfilled. He was driven insane, hidden away like a caged beast, until the chosen time had passed. At the end, he praises God and says that he has learned humility. The message of this story becomes important when future Babylonian kings forget the warning to remain humble. Which brings us to our next chapter in Daniel, describing the writing on the wall. Belshazzar was a new king of Babylon, likely not the direct son, but it's still referred in the chapter as Nebuchadnezzar, his father, probably meaning ancestor. There were a couple of kings in between Nebuchadnezzar, the son of Nabopolassar, and Belshazzar. However, one way or the other, Belshazzar is the king of Babylon, and he's reveling with vessels that had been taken from the temple. Now, this self-same hour, as we read in Daniel chapter 5, starting in verse 5, an incredible event occurs that really disturbs the king. In the selfsame hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosened, and his knees smote one against another. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom." Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Eventually, the queen suggests that there was a man who had served Nebuchadnezzar, who had the spirit of the holy gods, of course referring to Daniel. Daniel is summoned by the king to inspect the writing on the wall, and he's offered a generous reward to explain it. But he's not interested in reward. So we read in Daniel chapter 5, verse 17, "Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation." He then references how Nebuchadnezzar had been humbled by God, and that he should have known better. Then he goes on to explain the writing, starting in verse 25 of chapter 5. "And this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Uparsin. This is the interpretation of the thing, Mene. God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. So there is some subtlety about the words that were written on the wall. A common view of their interpretation, their simple interpretation, is meaning count. So mene, count, tekel, measure, uparsin, divide. So count, measure, divide. And there's a play on the word uparsin and the word peres as interpreted, where peres is related to division and uparsin is a plural form related to the Persians who would be doing the dividing. At any rate, one way or the other, it did not take long for this prophecy to be fulfilled. The last 2 verses of the chapter, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So this is something that can be confirmed. The method by which they overthrew this huge city that was thought to be unconquerable, with a tremendously well-defended wall, incredibly thick wall. It's of note how that occurred. It was built over the Euphrates River. And this was done so that they would always have a source of water. You can get rid of the Euphrates, and you couldn't lay siege long enough to starve the people out because they could keep growing food inside. However, the Persians dug a large canal out of the Euphrates River that lowered the level of the river enough for them to march under the wall. And they took the city that very night. Daniel was there to see the empire of Babylon fall. All right, next chapter, the lion's den. Darius the Mede recognized Daniel's value, even though he had been a wise man of the Chaldeans. There with the Indo-European king, he still recognized his worth, promoted him over the other princes and nobles in the region. And the natural reaction of the other self-important princes was envy. They determined that the only way to find occasion against Daniel was in his devotion to his religion. So in bad faith, they proposed to Darius a law that would require all petitions to go to him for 30 days. It doesn't say the reasoning or how they convinced Darius to sign off on that, but one can imagine new king in the region, overseeing a lot of people from maybe other lands. This would force kind of a unification. If things have to go through the new king, they would be forced to deal with it and kind of all be forced into this new order. You could see a plausible reason why a conquering king might think that this is a good idea. Of course, the people who were wanting to set Daniel up were not interested in that at all. They were interested in racing to tattletale on something that they could predict. If we read in Daniel chapter 6, verse 10, their predicted result was absolutely correct. Now, when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. So he knew that this was against the law, and he didn't even try to hide that he was going to serve God. He was going to continue to follow his faith, and he was unconcerned about being observed in so doing. Of course, Daniel's enemies raced to the king, and because he was unable to turn back the decree from being carried out, he was condemned to suffer the fate of being cast into a den of hungry lions. Now, this is in spite of the king, after he realizes that Daniel's going to be the victim of this, he spends all day trying to figure out some way to deliver Daniel. And the king still admired him in the last moment, calling to him, "Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee," offering this encouragement as the stone was rolled on in front of the mouth of the den, sealing it shut. As the king returned to his palace, he refused to sleep. He fasted, and early in the morning, as soon as he could, he rushed to the den of lions. And this is where we pick up our reading in Daniel chapter 6, verse 20. "And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. Forasmuch as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. Then was the king exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God." Now, of course, the king also ensured that justice would be done against those who had conspired in the spirit of envy against him. Verse 24 reads, "And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den." So Daniel continued to prosper during the reign of Darius and of Cyrus the Persian. Those are the main story elements in the book. And then we get into some apocalyptic visions that Daniel receives for the remainder of the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 7, we see some imagery, and you'll see this throughout the remaining chapters. It's imagery that's similar to what is found in the revelation of John the Divine. And also, as we discussed last week, the vision of Ezekiel. In Daniel chapter 7, he sees various kings arise in succession, and ultimately an antichrist figure that would fight against the saints until the coming of the Ancient of Days. We know from modern revelation that this title, Ancient of Days, belongs to Adam, and his return will be vital as a part of the restoration of all things, fulfilling the purpose that God gave to all men from the beginning, and returning all rights and priesthood and authority back to that God from whence they came, even to Jesus Christ. Daniel 8 uses similar imagery depicting Persia and Greece, followed by what would be Roman powers and their successors. Ultimately, again, an antichrist would fight against the Prince of Princes, but he would be broken. Daniel chapter 9 includes a visit to Daniel from the archangel Gabriel. He includes this important prophecy in Daniel chapter 9, verses 26 and 27. "And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. All right. So a couple of things from those verses. The Messiah being cut off, but not for himself. Of course, if we think about this a little bit, we can be reminded that indeed Jesus Christ was cut off from all other sources, forced to tread the winepress alone when he atoned for the sins of everyone else. Though he was innocent, he was cut off. There are few places in the Old Testament as clear as about this prediction that the Messiah will perform the atonement. Absolutely marvelous. Also, after the resurrection, the Jews fought against Rome, and Jerusalem was placed under siege, an abomination that maketh desolate. This is a phrase that's used by Jesus himself in Matthew chapter 24. It's also used a little later in Daniel, and we'll talk about that briefly as well. It's important to note there are similarities between the first and the second coming. This was all in the future from Daniel's perspective. The Messiah coming, there would be some problems, great trials, tribulations. Ultimately, Jesus would save. This theme of the Messiah coming to save, absolutely critical. Daniel 10 shows Daniel's interaction with an angel. And as several physical descriptions of angels in the scriptures, he includes describing that the angel has a face like lightning, feet like polished brass, and eyes like lamps of fire. These themes include things that are shining and bright, exceedingly light. He also describes in a couple of places in his interactions with the angel that his visions take a toll on him, and he requires to be strengthened in order to continue. This is something that we see in Revelation that occurs from Moses to Joseph Smith. The angel in this exchange in Daniel chapter 10 explains that he is striving against a Persian prince. Not likely a mortal being in Persian royalty, but some demonic force within Persia, perhaps a reference to the devil himself. He also explains that he and Michael, the archangel, are striving together. Again, a prediction that the coming of the Greeks will occur after the Persians have lost power. Daniel 11 is a longer chapter, and it discusses the conflicts between kings of various regions. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because many of these, it is tough to know exactly what it refers to, but many people look at this and believe that this is referring to the conflicts that arose from the fragments of empires that emerged after Alexander the Great's death. The Seleucid Empire in the north, the Ptolemies over in the south, over in Egypt, and they had multiple conflicts, and you know, they were separate empires that quarreled with one another. Daniel 12 represents another vision of the latter days that includes the archangel Michael. If we look in the first three verses, it reads, "And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And they that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament, and they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever." This is absolutely incredible imagery. We're finding people that are written in a book. This is very similar to what John saw of people whose names were written in the book of life. And we also get a reference here to resurrection, that those who are sleeping in the dust shall awake, some to everlasting life, others to everlasting contempt. This also indicates that the archangel Michael will be involved in some great conflict, and that ultimately the Jews will be delivered. Absolutely thrilling to see this imagery. It's one of the most plain references in the Old Testament to resurrection and the latter days, with some awaking to everlasting life and some to shame and contempt. This is absolutely referring to resurrection that will be made possible by the Lord Jesus Christ. As we continue through chapter 12, there are also a couple of references to a time and times and half a time, which can be interpreted as a year and 2 years and half a year. In other words, 3.5 years. And it corresponds to a number of days that are roughly that length. A couple of those are given a little bit later in the chapter. 1,290 days, 1,335 days, both of those over 3.5 years. Again, this reference to an abomination that maketh desolate, the siege of Jerusalem in the last days. Just thrilling imagery, absolutely important. But we're going to take a detour back to Daniel chapter 2 to close our longer podcast today. Let's talk about this chapter, perhaps one of the most important chapters in all the scriptures. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that troubles him, and he calls for his astrologers and soothsayers and magicians to interpret the dream. They ask him what it was and say, then we'll tell you what it means. But it's obviously important to Nebuchadnezzar that he doesn't want some cheap platitudes. So he refuses to give the dream, saying that it is gone from him. And to ensure that the interpretation is valid, he asks his wise men that they will give him both the dream and the interpretation, by which sign he will know that it's accurate. Of course, his astrologers explain that this cannot be done by men. Only the gods know the thoughts and dreams of the heart. So Nebuchadnezzar begins to wonder, why do I employ any of you people? And he threatens to kill them all unless his request is completed. So among his wise men is Daniel, who finds out about this situation. One of the chief guards comes and explains that they're going to kill all the wise men. And so he goes and says, just give me some time and we'll figure it out. And so Daniel goes to his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abed-nego. They fast, they pray. And it's worth noting that at this time, when he says, oh, just give me some time and we'll find out for you, he didn't know that what the dream was or what the interpretation was. He was just confident that God could help him because he was prepared by living obediently. That night, he receives the needed revelation, and he offers great thanks to God before going to the king. This is where we pick up our reading in Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 26. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen, and the interpretation thereof? Daniel answered in the presence of the king, and said, the secret which the king hath demanded, cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets, and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what shall come to pass hereafter? And he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. So then Daniel proceeds to give a description of the dream. He sees a man with an image of a man with a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, a belly of brass, legs of iron, and feet that are part iron and part clay. And he beholds until a stone which is cut out of the mountain without hands rolls and smites the image on its feet. The image falls and becomes as dust, and the stone rolls forth and becomes a mountain that fills the earth. Very vivid and specific description. Then Daniel provides the interpretation. The head of gold represents him, Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom of Babylon. And after Babylon would come another kingdom, represented by the arms. A third kingdom, represented by the belly of brass, would overcome them. A fourth kingdom, represented by the legs, would rule, and as iron is strong, so would they be strong and break all others. Finally, there would be many small kingdoms that would be partly strong and partly broken, as clay with iron is partly strong and partly broken. Then the stone. Starting in verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Forasmuch as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass hereafter, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation thereof sure. Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, and learned to honor Daniel's ability and respect his God. This means that this memorable dream and the whole circumstances surrounding it absolutely came from God. And the point of having such dramatic circumstances around who it was given to and how it was revealed was so that it would be valued and recorded and recognized, because it's one of the most important visions in the Old Testament, given to a heathen king, no less. What were those kingdoms? What can we get from this? Timing. This is something that's very rare in visions. A lot of the other things that we see, just abstract signs that kind of give you an indication. Sort of like Jesus himself taught in Matthew chapter 24 with the fig leaves indicating summer was nigh, or the red sky at morning being a sign of danger. These things would be signs of the times generally, but this vision is very specific in its timing. Daniel himself lived to see the fall of Babylon and being replaced by the chest and arms of silver, the Persians. The failure of Xerxes to invade Greece was later invoked by the Macedonian Greeks, including Alexander the Great, as they swept through like a belly of brass and overthrew all of the Persian forces in Egypt and throughout Asia, even reaching India, creating a large range of Hellenistic influence. Of course, the Greeks eventually declined. They were conquered by an empire with the strength of iron. The Romans. The Romans lasted for centuries, dividing into two empires as two legs, each of which eventually declined and fell, being supplanted by numerous small kingdoms. Many of these kingdoms were partly strong. Christian alliances in both the East and the West thwarted Ottoman invasions. They preserved what they had, even in the face of these great invading empires. but they were also partly broken. Feuds between these monarchs and lords in Europe changed boundaries, and many of these kingdoms were very, very small, constantly quarreling and all sorts of disaster. The point of this being the timing, because in the days of these kings, meaning the kings of these very small kingdoms that rose after the fall of Rome, is the time when the God of heaven will set up his unfailing kingdom after the Roman Empire. Now, of course, if we look at our situation now, these kingdoms have been swallowed up by numerous wars and revolutions. None of the monarchs who now reign in Europe maintain anything more than a figurehead status. Ceremonial roles. Parliaments, Congress, prime ministers, these are the elected, political, powerful people that run these nations. The sweeping forces that came with not only revolutions in France and Russia and other places, but the sweeping forces of Napoleon and World War I and World War II pretty much swallowed up everybody else. They're gone. That means it's too late for the God of heaven to set up a kingdom now. It has to have already happened. After the fall of Rome, before the world wars. Those are our time boundaries. And it's absolutely vital to understand that, because those who claim the concept of apostolic succession have a really big problem. The apostles of Jesus Christ, from whom they claim such succession, were called during the time of the Roman Empire. Though they laid the foundation of a kingdom, this was not the unfailing kingdom predicted by Daniel. In other words, there's no unbroken line of authority that goes back to Roman times. God waited until after Rome fell to establish this unfailing kingdom. And it's, as we mentioned before, too late to start something now to fulfill this prophecy. The days of these kings are over. Of course, the material by which the kingdom was forged is also of note. It wasn't some shining metal or a powerful alloy. It was a common stone cut out of a mountain. Its value is that it was not cut with the hands of men. It was established by God himself. This is referring to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, established in the days of these kings, towards the end of them, 1830, and with an influence that has gone to nations all over the world to gather scattered Israel and restore the ancient covenants and priesthood power that God intended to come to his children. Joseph Smith was not a well-educated man. We would not call him of gold or silver or brass or iron. He was carved out of American stone. And when the church was finally established away from the persecutions of the East, it became a prophetic voice with the power to reach the ends of the earth, an unfailing kingdom. We are building this unfailing kingdom. God gave clues to point to our time, signs by which his work would be recognized by the faithful. Watch and pray, just as Daniel and his friends did. Do not wait until a crisis to begin living as God would have you live. Now is the time. Start now, so that when the crisis comes, you, like Daniel and his friends, will be found worthy. We appreciate all the support for the Word Preacher podcast. Next week, we will be looking at Hosea and Joel. Of course, there's still a lot of stuff we did not cover in the book of Daniel, even with our extended podcast today. So take time with your family and individually and study that. And of course, as always, fight on.